Again, thanks. I'd like to thank everyone here at Lowell Observatory for the support and for letting me do this talk. Before we begin, I would also like to say that I know these sort of subjects can get a little bit contentious, and I'm going to try to avoid controversy for the most part. My goal here is really more to sort of ask and contemplate questions more than to answer them. It'll probably be inevitable that a couple of my political leanings will come through at some point. So I should emphasize that the observatory itself is neutral on just about all political issues, and any opinions that I state are mine and mine alone, and I take full responsibility for them.
Do you add religion into that too? Like, let's just make it fun.
Well, we did that.
All right.
So I'll be stopping about 3 or 4 times throughout the talk for about 2 or 3 minutes each, just to give people a chance to ask immediate questions and for clarifications and make any comments you want to at that point. Then at the end, after the end of the talk, there will be a much more extensive opportunity for questions and discussion and comments and whatnot. At last month's Lowell 42 talk, where Michael West talked about spirituality and science, there was a really fun, really respectful discussion afterwards, and that's a tradition that I would like to continue tonight. One sort of moderation restriction that I would like to make regarding the discussion at the end, just to reduce the risk of tempers getting high, is that I'm going to avoid talking about any living politicians during this talk. Political scientists and philosophers I'll talk about a lot, but living politicians I'm going to avoid talking about any of those, and I will ask that people avoid talking or discussing living politicians during the questions and discussion periods as well. All right, so one thing I'd like to start by sort of highlighting is that there is a difference between the concepts of political and controversial. Arguably, all human activity is, to some extent, political activity. Aristotle, for example, this is one of the really big things that he said. He said that humans are innately political animals, and we talk, we live, we debate, we live in societies, and we can't avoid doing that. So humans, for Aristotle, are innately political animals, and all human activity is to some extent political activity. The natural state of humans is to live in a society and with other people, and that inevitably means that you're going to be making compromises and building power relationships and culture and traditions and so forth, and all of those things have politics. Pretty much all of our actions, I think, even private ones, are political because they happen in a political context and have political consequences. I'm not saying that we should, think about the politics of every single little thing that we do, because you go crazy if you do that. But we shouldn't pretend that that's not the case either, I think. Now, when people say that something is especially political, what they're usually actually saying is that it's controversial. Something can be political without being controversial, like, say, Julius Caesar's invasion of Gaul, has deep political implications to this day, but I doubt that it's been the source of too many bar fights lately. Similarly, like, the idea is that both boys and girls should be allowed to have a basic education and that people shouldn't be sent to prison for no reason. These are deeply political ideas, but I would hope not controversial ones. Even a statement as seemingly innocuous as like the Grand Canyon is pretty is, in some ways political, because it lends more support to certain worldviews and to certain actions than to others. Government support for science is another example of an issue that I think is political, but has been largely uncontroversial over the last few decades, as are, most findings of scientific studies. So there's a difference between the political and the controversial. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be mostly going with the, strict just political but not controversial. But there are a few controversial things I will be talking about, although I'll be trying to present them in a neither disparaging nor neither a disparaging way, nor will I be advocating for them. All right. Now, it's not hard to think of ways that science is political. Definitions can be highly political, such as the definition of planet. Which of all these balls in the solar system do we call planets? That's, a very controversial example, albeit a fairly innocuous one, I think. The fact that research receives government funding is political, and, which specific research projects get funded, that's a political question, too. And the answers to all these questions, they have political implications. For example, the political decision to fund the Voyager spacecraft generated wonderful pictures and knowledge about the outer solar system, which generated a lot of support for science and helped justify the political decisions to fund programs like New Horizons and Cassini. So everything is connected to everything else. These political decisions have political consequences, and of course also, scientists themselves are human beings, and scientists don't, magically leave the non-scientist parts of their humanity at the door when they enter a lab, right? So once we start looking at science as political, we can start seeing it in a few new ways. And a few of these we'll briefly explore. So the concept of science encompasses a lot of different things. It's a body of knowledge, but it's also a process, and it's a set of methods, and it's also an institution, and in some ways it's also a culture. And each of those different aspects of science have their own politics. Now, one of the aspects of science is that it's been just incredibly successful in advancing our understanding of the universe. And that understanding has, dramatically altered, and I would say in most ways improved, the way that we live our lives. Because of the successes of science, though, the name of science has often been claimed by people with a political agenda, for better or worse. For example, pseudoscience and claims of science expertise have been invoked to advocate for a huge range of dubious political causes, from racism and colonialism and imperialism to the benefits of smoking cigarettes. There were actually a lot of very respected biologists a couple hundred years ago who tried to incorporate racism into biology. You may have read a book by Stephen Jay Gould, The Mismeasure of Man, that discusses that in some detail. To highlight the tendency of different scholars to claim scientific standing for political positions, albeit in a hopefully less negative light than racism, but I'd like to compare two different economists that try to to try to talk about economics in a political way, and those are and to claim it as a scientific study. And those two economists are Karl Marx and Milton Friedman. Now, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were certainly among the most controversial and influential figures of the last couple centuries, and probably, I would say, among the most misunderstood as well. We could spend days talking about Marx's ideas and how those ideas differ from popular opinions of them, and how both of those differ from how the Soviet Union attempted to implement some of his ideas. But what's pertinent right now is how Marx viewed the world and how he analyzed the world and the economy. Marx pioneered a concept called historical materialism. Historical materialism is basically the idea that specific physical means of producing what people need to live have a profound influence on the culture and politics of society. A sample historical materialist argument would, go as follows. If farming tools are made by blacksmiths who need years to master their craft, then those blacksmiths will be in demand and will be difficult to replace, and they'll have a certain amount of power and standing in society. But if those tools start to be made by factories, which are run by people who just need to pull levers, then those people will be easy to replace, and they'll have a different standing in society than the blacksmiths did. So this might seem obvious, but a lot of economic models, both back then and today, only really deal with the efficiency of how we make things, and not so much with the political consequences. So by centering his ideas of political economy on the material, physical world, Marx and Engels believed that they had begun to bring political and economic philosophy into something of the same realm as the natural sciences, like physics and chemistry. The government of the Soviet Union would actually go on to claim that the government and their policies were designed scientifically. And of course, Marx and Engels concluded that market capitalism is, while preferable to quite a few of the systems that came before it, ultimately broken beyond repair. All right, so to contrast, Milton Friedman was one of the 20th century's most influential economists. His ideas have been foundational to modern American libertarianism and have seen widespread invocation by both the International Monetary Fund and fiscally conservative politicians and political philosophers all over the world. Friedman actually won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, I should say, in 1976. Now, much of Friedman's work was in response to the man who was arguably the most influential American economist, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes is most famous for basically encouraging government intervention in the economy, especially on the demand side. According to Keynes, if during an economic downturn people weren't spending enough to drive employment, the government could step in and fill the gap by just spending money, which would employ people who would spend more money themselves, and that would sort of jumpstart the economy. Keynes believed that most of the flaws and downturns in a capitalist economy could be overcome or at least mitigated by proper government intervention and regulation. Friedman offered a sharply different interpretation than Keynes of the proper role of government in the economy. Friedman believed that crises and downturns in the economy were much more likely to be the result of government intervention rather than to be solved by it. In addition, Friedman emphasized mathematical modeling to a far greater extent than Keynes did. In 1953, Friedman wrote a book called Positive Economics, which made a case for economists to try to treat their field with the same experimental and mathematical rigor that the natural scientists, like physicists and astronomers, do. Friedman was also a passionate advocate of free market capitalism. He claimed that free markets were both necessary for the freedom of people, and that his mathematical models indicated that free markets brought about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So we have two really immensely influential economists, Karl Marx, who claimed scientific status based on the grounding of his ideas in the physical and the material, in the depth and detail of his analysis, and on his emphasis on observation and historical context. On the other hand, we have Friedman, who claimed scientific status based on stuff like mathematical modeling, statistics, and an emphasis on data and testing. And of course, the two men drew diametrically opposite conclusions about the role of government and the economy and about capitalist economy in general. Marx, of course, believed that a capitalist economy was untenable, and Friedman believed that it was the only, best possible economic system. Of course, the thing is that both Marx's history and Friedman's data are open to interpretation. I've seen debates where Keynesians and Friedmanites argue for a long time over the meaning of actually relatively small variations in the economy. So you can decide for yourself whether either of these two philosophies are scientific or not. But well, the real world never seems to be quite that easy. The depressing stuff in this lecture is a little bit front-loaded, but we'll get past it. All right, so now I would be a little bit remiss if I were to give a talk on science and politics, I think, without at least mentioning this guy. This is Trofim Lysenko. Lysenko was a Soviet biologist. He did work on genetics. And Lysenko basically believed in this idea that traits that were acquired by an organism during its life cycle could be passed on to their descendants. So, for example, if you exposed wheat to really cold temperatures, then that wheat would intrinsically adapt itself to that cold temperatures within its own lifetime, and then the future generations of that wheat would be better adapted to those sorts of cold temperatures. Lysenko's work actually came, or at least started to come into its own, during the middle of what was in the Soviet Union one of the worst famines in human history. It was a famine that was either began or at least exacerbated by Stalin's policies of very rapid industrialization and collectivization of Soviet agriculture. And Lysenko's work, if it was correct, could have really profound implications for Soviet agriculture. In addition, Lysenko marketed his ideas as kind of a communist alternative to the more traditional, maybe even capitalist ideas of sort of Darwinian or traditional biology. Lysenko's work actually caught the eye of Stalin himself, and Lysenko started to really rapidly rise through the ranks of the Soviet government and the Soviet scientific establishment. Critics of Lysenko's work actually started being arrested. Some of them were executed. In 1948, criticism of Lysenko's ideas were actually officially outlawed in the Soviet Union, and would remain so until the mid-60s, until well into the Khrushchev eras. Now, of course, most of Lysenko's ideas were incorrect. He was wrong about the mechanism of evolution. Organisms don't pass on acquired traits, at least not in the specific way that Lysenko was claiming. Lysenko's ideas were attempted to have been sort of applied to this huge famine in the Soviet Union, but of course without success. And Lysenkoism is also generally considered to have set Soviet biology back by decades. Now, the Lysenko affair is often kind of interpreted as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing politics and science. Honestly, well, there's something to that, but I think it might be a little bit reductive. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's even possible to completely separate science and politics, even if that were desirable. Scientists have, for better or worse, very often been engaged in the political implications of their work. For example, take issues surrounding nuclear weapons. Now, Albert Einstein very famously wrote to Franklin Roosevelt to encourage him to start developing nuclear weapons, and that was out of fear, of course, that the Nazis were working on their own. And Einstein would later say that he had come to deeply regret that decision. Carl Sagan was famously very involved in advocating for limits to nuclear testing and armaments. Isaac Asimov, again on the popularization of science, also wrote both fiction and nonfiction, advocating for limits to nuclear weapons and talking about the ramifications of nuclear weapons, even if there wasn't a nuclear war. Hermann Mueller, who actually won a Nobel Prize for his work on the effects of radiation on genetics, he was also very active in the anti-nuclear weapons movement. And he actually said that it was Hermann Mueller actually said that it was the responsibility of scientists to be politically engaged in the consequences of their studies and in their fields. So just like scientists don't leave the rest of their humanity outside when they enter the lab, they also don't leave their scientific knowledge behind when they act in their roles as citizens. It's actually maybe something of a paradox. Society benefits when scientific data can be viewed as non-controversial because that data that comes from science is vital for making informed political decisions. At the same time, society suffers if scientists can't speak openly on controversial issues in their fields, largely because scientists tend to be among the most well-informed on the issues of those fields. What I think we can say take from the Lysenko affair is that science, if nothing else, is that science can't function without a free exchange of ideas, and if criticism is outlawed, or if scientists might fear political reprisal for speaking their minds. And if that's the case, then there can be really dire implications for society at large. All right, now, of course, science is a lot more than just individuals. Science is also an institution, and that institution has its own politics, and it plays a role in the politics of broader society. And science as an institution and society can push and pull it on each other in some fairly interesting ways. For example, science in some ways is very highly anti-authoritarian. As we've discussed, science can't fully function if criticism is not fully allowed, and that's really in some ways a very anti-authoritarian principle. George Orwell actually kind of considered this kind of freedom to be foundational to a free society. In 1984, the famous dystopian novel, the protagonist, Winston, says, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, then all else follows." Of course, science has existed and has been advanced in authoritarian societies, but I think we can still kind of expect that a functioning scientific community will generally encourage an intellectually free society. On the other hand, science as an institution is also quite hierarchical. out of necessity. Degrees are conferred by strongly hierarchical academic systems, and with good reason. If somebody has a degree in medicine or in engineering, then you need to know that they have a basic baseline of knowledge and competence. Modern society can't function otherwise. Similarly, if you're the government and you have $1 billion particle accelerator, and that scientists have to apply for time on it, well, you're going to have more confidence that the person is not wasting the time on that particle accelerator if they have some kind of credentials from a respected institution. So that means that, teachers and administrators and institutions as a whole have a lot of power over people that are trying to make their way in those different fields. Put simply, we need gatekeepers, but we shouldn't deny that a gatekeeper is a position of power, a position of authority. So we have kind of another paradox. Science is anti-authoritarian intellectually, but is highly authoritarian structurally. Now, the hierarchical structure of academia, it might be largely necessary, but it can still have consequences. It's not unheard of, for example, for professors to take credit for the research of their students. The structure involved in academia and science might also slow down beneficial changes and make certain barriers more difficult to overcome. For example, there are still far fewer women in astronomy than there are men, and I've read that the same goes for physics and a lot of other sciences. So, for example, according to the Women in Astronomy Working Group of the International Astronomical Union, in 2005, just under 16%. And these are screenshots taken from that working group's website, by the way. So in 2015, just under 16% of the total number of astronomers in the International Astronomical Union were women. That's up from only about 12% That's up from only about 12 or 13% in 2003, which is this column over here. So progress is being made, but it's slow. The only countries that were listed in this data that had more than 30% of their delegations as women were actually just Argentina and Romania. Ukraine came close at about 29%. The U.S. delegation was about 13.5% women. So I'm not saying that academia is at fault for sexism, of course, but what I am saying is that we could at least imagine that the rigid hierarchical structures of academia could make these sorts of barriers more difficult to surmount, might amplify the effects of sexism, and also make that kind of sexism more difficult to change, at least institutionally. All right, so continuing along this sort of line of thinking, if I can start bringing up a couple of somewhat more radical thinkers. One of the more famous books in the philosophy of education is a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed by this guy, Paulo Freire. The book is most famous for sort of criticizing and opposing what Freire calls the banking method of education. Basically, the top-down model of teaching where knowledge is transferred one way from a teacher to a student, and the student's only responsibility is to absorb and to practice the knowledge. Knowledge in this model is transferred to the student much like money is transferred to a bank, hence the name. If you've ever seen a poster on a school that says, "Free knowledge, bring your own container," then that pretty much sums up that philosophy nicely. Freire can criticize the banking model as treating students as passive objects rather than as active agents, as removing students from their context as members of society and of the world and of culture, and of presenting knowledge as static rather than as active. Freire's ideas on education went far beyond just rejecting the banking model of teaching, though. Freire saw this hierarchical structure of academia as kind of a microcosm for oppressive authoritarian hierarchies in broader society. For Freire, the relationships of the colonizer and the colonized, of the tyrant and the tyrannized, of the dictator and the oppressed citizen, those kind of relationships are mimicked in the relationship of teacher and student in the banking model of education. And he thought that by raising students in that kind of authoritarian system and by pushing them to internalize that system, Freire saw the banking model of education as really helping to perpetuate systems of authoritarian oppression in broader society. Freire's wish actually was to ultimately dismantle the banking model of education, not just because it's a bad model, but he wanted to actually dismantle it as part of a broader program of overcoming oppression and liberating people in society. All right, so as long as I'm bringing up some of the more radical thinkers, might be a good time to talk a little bit about Michel Foucault. And actually, Foucault is probably the most controversial of the figures that I'm bringing up today, at least in academia. Foucault contemplated how power functions in society. He contemplated other things, but that's what he's best known for. And if I can use a bit of a blunt metaphor, Foucault's conception of how power works in society, it's a bit like how the Force works in Star Wars, except without the telekinesis and the precognition. But Foucault envisioned power as like all around us. It's generated by all people. All people have power, albeit some more than others. And by supporting different institutions and opinions and values, you're expressing your power, and you're also giving power to those kinds of institutions. And and again, like the Force, power for Foucault, it both controls your actions, or both controls your actions and obeys your commands. For Foucault, virtually all of society's truths, he thought, were embedded in sort of this network of power that pervaded society. And like all these other nodes of power that he thought about, these ideas about truth, what we think of as truth, it both exerted its own power, but it's also an expression of the powers that be in society. So they exert power on their own too. Foucault called this sort of concept regimes of truth. A regime of truth for Foucault includes, for example, what discourses are present in a society, what conversations are present, what methods are used for determining truth, for determining what's true and what's false, who gets to determine what truth is and how we treat those people, and so on and so forth. So regimes of truth, according to Foucault, determine a society's morality, its ideas of beauty, what people and actions are admired in society, and just about anything that one could have an opinion on, and actually quite a few things that you wouldn't normally think need opinions. Now, I've read that Foucault actually kind of intentionally avoided talking about whether modern scientific discoveries, whether the laws of physics and so forth, were subject to these kinds of regimes of truth, but it's an idea that I think is still worth considering. Now, I'm not suggesting, I should make clear, that stuff like the laws of physics are going to be changed based on society's biases. With Lysenko, we saw that, if nothing else, that the laws of nature are not so malleable. But I think we should at least consider the possibility that power influences the way we think of scientific truth in other ways. For example, people might have been more skeptical of claims of scientific racism, or scientific claims of racism, such as phrenology and craniology and so forth, if those claims hadn't been as politically convenient. Conversely, a lot of people have claimed, or at least argued, that global or climate change or global warming, part of the reason that it's been difficult to get people to accept, despite the overwhelming evidence that it's actually happening, that might be because of the possible political consequences of it. Similarly, maybe we would be more advanced in some fields of science than in others if we lived under different regimes of truth. Maybe there are things that we don't even think, maybe scientific ideas that we don't even think to study because of the regime of truth that we live in. How scientific knowledge is used, both technologically and philosophically, might depend somewhat on the regime of truth that we live in. And even, I will say that even some scientific concepts might be different, even if the laws of nature might be different, the concepts in science might be different under a different regime of truth. Maybe if we lived under a little bit of a different power structure in society, then Pluto would be considered a planet still. On the other hand, if we lived in a different power structure in a slightly different way, maybe Pluto never would have been considered a planet in the first place. Something else that we might want to consider along these same sorts of lines is the culture of science itself, and the values of the scientific community. Science is both a community and an institution, so it has its own values, it has its own culture, and those things are going to influence the broader society and culture in their own ways too. Now, certainly I think that a lot of the ideas that come with science, a lot of the values are, well, at least, and I may be revealing my own regime of truth here, but I think fairly unambiguously positive, like looking at things critically and rationally and questioning things wherever you can. But there are other aspects of science that might be worth discussion too, about the culture of science, and one is how we relate ourselves to nature. Many scientists have talked about science as helping them have an attitude of connection and unity with nature, and that science helps them helps them have this value of interconnectedness with all living things. For astronauts, there's actually a word for this. It's called the overview effect. It's basically the shift in consciousness that comes from seeing the world firsthand in space. So here's a clip from the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum of Sandra Magnus, an astronaut, describing her experience of it.
You know that in a completely different way, because it is very startling. I remember the first words out of my mouth when I opened the Palo Bay doors on my first flight was, "Oh my goodness, look how thin our atmosphere is." It's incredible how it hits you, that experience of seeing the atmosphere as this, no kidding, paper thin layer of air that protects us and keeps us safe. And your view of the planet and your experience of the planet changes at that point, because you see it as, no kidding, a spaceship. You see it as one integrated system. We can sit here in this room and we know that China is half a world away and there's a big ocean in between and there's probably trees and mountains and rocks and people living over there. You know that, but when you see the planet from the way that Mike and I did and our colleagues, it gives you a completely different impression of the connection between us here and everybody else all over the world and all of the rest of the planet. So it really does change your view.
All right, so there's that. On the other hand, there might be in some respects actually an opposite effect too. Part of the methodology of science involves kind of separating phenomena into their components. So you can just change one of those components at a time and sort of figure out exactly which of the components was responsible for some change in something else. That's not how everything progresses, but that's kind of your classical idealized scientific experiment. And it's, again, it's been immensely successful in learning new stuff about the universe. Now, that kind of experiment, it is a tool, and the thing is, tools still carry their own worldviews with them. With any tool, there's a certain. It might be just very innocuous, but with just about any tool, there's a certain worldview and a certain politics that sort of is embedded in that tool. So, for example, say that I ask you to make a chair out of wood, and on the one hand, I give you a hammer and nails, and on the other hand, I give you a bunch of rope and twine. How you envision that project going forward is going to be very different depending on the two scenarios. And so the way that you envision the world will be, at least that very small part of the world, will be a little bit different as a result. So tools kind of carry with them their own worldviews, and the tool that is the scientific method is not necessarily any different. And those worldviews that come with that, they don't necessarily have to osmose into life outside of science, but it's possible that they could. So one thing to think about, for example, the classical experiment draws this kind of strong connection between understanding the universe and controlling it. Because you have to control your different variable in some. You have to be able to control your different variables in some ways in the classical experiment to figure out what's affecting what, right? Stephen Hawking, so there's this connection between understanding and controlling the universe. Stephen Hawking actually made this explicit in his memoir. He said that, if you understand how the universe operates, you control it in a way. He was talking about how as a kid, he had always loved to build these wonderful models, these systems, these games and such, that he could control every aspect of them and figure out and sort of explore all the subtleties of how they worked. And that after he got his PhD, his research and work in theoretical physics sort of fulfill that same emotional need. So there's this, arguably there's this kind of connection between between at least this particular aspect of the scientific method and this sort of worldview where you can control the world. Now, there's other ways that, the classical experiment, the idealized experiment at least, does have its own kind of worldview. It requires sort of dividing objects up into their different components. It sort of implies conceptualizing the experimenter and the experiment as completely separate entities. And I've heard some people argue that it might even sort of contribute to what you might call a mechanistic worldview, where the world is like a machine, and a certain stimulus will always lead to a certain predictable and constant effect and consistent effect, like in a machine. All right, now, another thing is if you've had lots of success with a particular tool, there's always going to be this sort of temptation to use that tool whenever you can, right? And so there's often lots of temptation to use tools of science in tools that methodological tools that come from like physics and chemistry in branches of science like sociology where they might not necessarily be appropriate. There's, for example, a long history in sociology of people, and indigenous people in particular, being sort of approached as objects of study rather than basically as people, rather than as potential partners in the creation of knowledge. The Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith, in her book Decolonizing Methodologies, one of the things she talks about is this kind of alienating effect where her people and her culture were studied by British scientists, and some of those scientists meant well, but they were still they were still steeped in British cultures and British assumptions and also in British power structures. The British sociologists would make would sometimes make these sort of dubious claims of objectivity in their research, at least partially based on the use of what they considered to be scientific research methods. And then Maori children in their schools, which were run by the British, learned about their own culture from the perspective of the British. So I think it's worth reiterating that, when studying people, power dynamics is never something that should really be ignored. But there's a broader point too. If we try to study ourselves in a scientific manner, or even if we, use these scientific methods and the values of them start creeping out into our broader life, how do the research methods affect our collective self-conception? If we're studying ourselves scientifically, do those methods change how we see ourselves? Now, the incredible success of science might also cultivate an attitude that, well, some might call it hubris, but others would argue that it's the confidence necessary to advance the well-being of humanity. This kind of conflict is actually kind of brought to a point by proposals of geoengineering. Geoengineering refers to basically engineering projects designed to cause intentional changes on the Earth on a global scale. And this sort of thing has often been proposed as a method of counteracting climate change. Geoengineering advocates have proposed a very wide range of projects, from dumping iron in the ocean to encourage phytoplankton growth, which would absorb carbon dioxide, to injecting sunlight-blocking sulfates into the stratosphere, which is what this image is sort of depicting the plan for doing, proposals for doing that, to things like actually basically launching swarms of mirrors into space to deflect sunlight. Now, opponents of geoengineering point to, possible side effects on ecosystems across the Earth. For example, reduced inflow of sunlight might affect plant growth, and encouraging huge phytoplankton blooms could have unpredictable effects on marine ecosystems. Opponents point to what they see as sort of an inherent unpredictability of nature. Now, there's this thing in studies of nature called emergent properties. And a simple but well-known example is actually, okay. Well, Let me play this because it's fun. Or Todd, would you get it? Thanks. My apologies for the delay. But a simple but well-known example of emergent property is basically where you have mixed cornstarch and water in just the right proportions and put them on a speaker, and then you can see it acting in some rather weird ways. Now, you could understand cornstarch individually and water individually and acoustics and sound individually. You could understand all of those things very well and very thoroughly and still never expect that when you combine them, you get something like this, right? So science can, of course, study emergent systems and emergent properties, especially once they've already been discovered. But, the classical idealized experiment, where you only really study one variable at a time, that's not really ideal for studying this kind of thing or for searching for them. Now, ecosystems and social systems are full of these kind of emergent properties. And, some of those emergent properties we might not even recognize as such because we're just kind of used to them being there. So this means, for example, that we can't necessarily understand a forest just by understanding all of the organisms and nutrients and energy that go into it. And changes to an ecosystem or to a social system might have, unpredictable consequences, even if all of the elements directly involved in that change are individually well understood. So, does the amazing success of science in understanding and predicting the world, in helping develop all these fantastic technologies that, enrich our lives, does that give us a false confidence that we can understand and predict a complex world better than we really can? And if so, what are the consequences? On the other hand, advocates of geoengineering and of this other worldview would say that these sorts of sentiments hold us back from realizing humanity's full potential, can keep us from implementing the best solutions to the problems that face us, and that, if there are adverse side effects to the things that we do, then we can just sort of engineer our way out of those as well. The thing about geoengineering is it really cuts to the heart of, some really basic debates in philosophy and science. Like what is our place in the world? What is our relationship to nature? One prominent advocate of engineering, Stuart Brand, famously said, "We are as gods and we have to get good at it." That's a fairly strong statement about our relationship with nature, right? Now, I suspect that a lot of, maybe most geoengineering advocates wouldn't go quite that far, but the premise of geoengineering still implies a certain worldview and a certain set of ideas about our relationship with nature, our relationship with the world around us. Now, humans, of course, have been intentionally modifying our living conditions and our landscapes for basically as long as there have been people, but, building a house and, altering the entire global climate based on the political decision, those are very different things, even on a basic philosophical level. Now, advocates of geoengineering, like Stuart Brand, tend to believe in sort of the power of innovation, of science and technology and the economy to solve just about any problem that nature is going to throw at us. Opponents of geoengineering tend to take sort of a more humble approach to our relationship with nature, to emphasize our interconnectedness and emphasize the complexity of the world that we live in. Now, both of those viewpoints actually, as we've talked about, can be seen as sort of having grown out of different aspects of science as a culture. I'd sort of like to wrap things up by talking about the future of science and politics, and not to make any predictions, but more to just sort of say how hard predictions are to make. Now, a lot of you know about Elon Musk, the CEO of SpaceX, which is basically a private spaceflight company. He is very loudly talking about funding and founding a permanent human settlement on Mars. And a lot of scientists, including Stephen Hawking, have also been pushing for humanity to politically to settle other worlds, so that a single disaster wouldn't be able to wipe out the whole species. And actually, by appearances, as far as I can tell, we're not all that far from technologically being able to undertake a project like this. So, a question arises, what might the politics of a future Martian settlement or something like that look like? Now, I've read a lot in both fiction and nonfiction where authors kind of envision a society in space that's basically a pure practice of their own favorite political philosophy. Space is kind of a tabula rasa, a clean slate, if you will. I don't think that'll work, and basically just because necessity is always the enemy of purity, and politics, of course, evolve. So as we've seen, politics can be driven by a lot of different things, including the physical means of production, what people do on a day-to-day basis to survive, the philosophies that people grow up with, and even, just on a basic level, their relationship with the land that they live on. A settlement on Mars would face profoundly different political problems than civilizations on the Earth ever have. For example, if a society has to manufacture its own oxygen, how will the government and the people deal with it if the people who manufacture that oxygen decide to go on strike? How will the government deal with civil unrest if a bomb could, make a city's atmosphere escape into space or into Mars? How would issues of population growth and family planning be dealt with, again, if there's a specific finite amount of air that, the machines of a society are capable of producing? Even some of the really fundamental ideas of political philosophy that we actually kind of take for granted in our society would come into question in a Martian society. For example, probably the most influential political philosopher in terms of American government was John Locke. John Locke is a social contract theorist. Basically, social contract theory is this idea that by participating in society, you implicitly agree to abide by society's rules and norms. And one of the justifications that's been put forward for social contract theories is basically that, if you don't like it, then you could go live as a hermit somewhere, away from society or anybody else. Now, in most places on Earth, you could at least sort of imagine being able to go live as a hermit somewhere, even if in practice it'd be very, very difficult. But if you were living in a colony on Mars, it'd be instantly and unescapably clear that that would be impossible. So one of the main justifications for the philosophy at the very heart of American politics just basically vanishes if you're on the context of Mars. So it's become almost cliche to point out that, if we ever do meet alien life, after growing up and after evolving in an alien environment, its physiology would be almost incomprehensible to us. And I suspect that we could probably say the same thing about alien politics. Politics in alien worlds will face alien challenges and will be shaped by alien environments. And so I expect the politics and political philosophies of alien worlds will eventually become equally alien to us, even if the practitioners are our fellow humans. Now, as for science on Earth, it's hard to know where things will go. With a few exceptions, science and support for science have been pretty non-controversial in American society. Personally, I think this has been to society's benefit, but, everything changes eventually. It's always a possibility that, one way or another, support for science will become a controversial issue. If that happens, we have to wonder, how will science respond to it? Science, for example, has avoided fairly successfully getting involved in political coalitions, at least as an institution. But, political coalitions are basically how things get done in American politics in general. So, if science becomes controversial, will scientists start trying to, join political coalitions to try to keep support for science, or will they, as they have been for decades by this point, still keep actively trying to avoid any political coalitions and try to stay sort of politically neutral? Also, as ecological and economic pressures increase in the coming years, as I think that they probably will, there's going to be increasing pressure on scientists to start taking sides on things, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, and to what extent science and scientists are going to be able to stay politically neutral and stay out of controversial issues. So, science, to wrap things up, science doesn't exist outside of politics. And whether the goal is to stay neutral or to contribute to the issues of the day, I think that politics is something that scientists are going to increasingly need to consider.